Good morning, everyone. I'm a business and public policy student at MIT in Harvard. My name is Henna, and I've had the distinct pleasure of helping to plan our next panel, along with a wonderful team of fellow students. The panel is the utility of the future, and it will explore how greater decarbonization and decentralization is shifting business models for energy delivery and services. Our moderator is Peter Kelly-Detwiler of NorthBridge Energy Partners, and our panelists include Gail Besser of SEPA, Surya Panditi of Enel North America, and Mackay of National Grid. And they'll introduce themselves further shortly. Just a quick reminder to the audience members to use the Zoom feature Q&A function to submit written questions and to upvote your favorites, and Peter will get to those near the end of the panel. I'll hand it off to Peter now to get us started.
Sure. Can you see me? You can't see me. It says unable to start video because the host has stopped it. Does that mean I'm logged in the wrong link?
We will try to get that sorted out. We're not sure why.
Can you hear me, Hannah?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Let me see. Start my video. The host asked me to start my video. Okay, here we go. Now we're live. Oh, good. We've got everyone on board. Okay, great. So let's kick this off. So we've got today Mackay Miller, Director of Strategy, U.S. Strategy at National Grid. Mackay, can you raise your hand so everyone knows? Excellent. Thank you. And Gail Besser, Managing Director of Regulatory Innovation and Utility Business Models at Smart Electric Power Alliance. Janet, how are you this morning? And Surya Panditi, Head of Enel North America. Surya, hello. Nice to see you all in your respective studios. So what we're going to do this morning, as I look out over a really stormy ocean right now, glad I'm inside because the wind is pelting the windows here. What we're going to do essentially is have each panelist introduce themselves for about 3 minutes. Talk about what they do and particularly how their job ties into this creation of the utility of the future. And Janet, since you were looking at this from the big picture policy level, I'd love to start with you because at the end of the day, it's the rules of the sandbox that happen at the regulatory level that ultimately inform everything that happens downstream. And that's in fact what the last panel was talking about, is how policy and regulatory issues really do set the stage. So could you kindly talk to us for a few minutes about what you're working on at SEPA and how that ties into this greater conversation we're having?
Sure, I'm going to share my screen here so that you can see my slides, and I'm trusting that you can all hear me.
Yeah, we can see them and we can hear you.
Okay. So very quickly, from the Smart Electric Power Alliance, our vision is a carbon-free energy system by 2050. And our mission is really facilitating that transition in a smart way. What that means is actually referring back to the previous panel, data-based, evidence-based. We're a nonprofit research, data, collaboration organization. We've got almost 1,200 members. They run the gamut of all the utilities in the system, solution providers, technology providers, regulators, policymakers, government. So we bring all of those voices together to try to put together what are the things that are going to be needed to get to this utility of the future and a carbon-free future. We do this by organizing our work into 4 pathways. One is utility business models, regulatory innovation, grid integration, and transportation electrification. And about a year ago, I started at SEPA to lead the utility business models and regulatory innovation panels because they're integrally related. We can't have utilities changing their business models unless we change the way we regulate them. I mean, Abigail talked about the constraints of regulation. And one of the things that we are working on is putting together the data that can become the evidence in the regulatory proceedings that Abigail referred to, so we can move to this clean energy future. So really quickly, one of the initiatives we led is called Renovate. It's about enabling innovation with a focus on the scalable deployment of technologies and operating models, new technologies and operating models, so that in fact we can get to this future. We work with a number of people, and first things, you can't get to the right answer unless you have the right questions. So our questions focused on people and knowledge, educating everybody on the new technologies, as well as educating all the stakeholders that the previous panel was talking about how regulatory decisions get made and what's needed to influence those regulatory decisions, and the fact that you have to put evidence together. Talked about managing risk and uncertainty. This is risk and uncertainty that a utility may see when it makes a filing. Is it going to get its cost recovery? Are its rates going to be viewed as just and reasonable, prudent, used, and useful, just throwing around some of the regulatory jargon. But some of the other things, risk and uncertainty is associated with the technologies themselves. So how do you bound that risk for customers? And we talk about pilots, innovation funds, things like that. Managing the increased rate of change. I was struck yesterday by a comment that I think, I'm going to forget her name, made it was, I think, is that technology is moving faster than regulatory processes, and this is a problem. And finally, complexity of objectives. And I think this is really about how do you coordinate with your legislature? A legislature or a governor announces a 100% clean mandate, but if the PUC doesn't have the enabling authority to act on that, it's pretty hard to get there. So what do we come up with for solutions? Oops, sorry. So we had 4 categories of solutions: collaborative and informal processes, alternative regulation, education, and cross-coordination. We mapped those solutions to the problems that we identified, and really the goal of our efforts are to give tools to regulators so that they can see their way clear, they can be comfortable, they have the evidence they need to approve investments in new technologies, new ways of operating utilities, so that the utility can become what customers are going to actually expect it to be in the future, and address problems like resilience, COVID, other things that come down the pike that we can't anticipate right now. I think here's a quick slide. You'll be able to look at this. It has a bunch of resources that we have available, and hope you'll check them out.
Yeah, if I can, thank you very much. If I can comment, it's definitely worth your time to go on the SEPA website. They have annual reports on storage installations, on distributed energy resources, and multiple other topics. So really helpful and useful information. So as we're dealing in this regulatory environment, Mackay, your group is often right embroiled in this conversation, and obviously implementors of a lot of what is coming out of those legislative and PUC decisions. So how does that factor into your role? What Janet's working on, how does that then translate into action on the ground? What are you working on?
We are day to day, really interfacing with a lot of these questions that Janet raised so well. So the cadence of rate cases that we propose represent in many ways an evolutionary cycle of what our customers are asking for and what policymakers are asking for as well. So this really is a joint project of deciding what a utility should be. I do have a couple of slides that lay out how I think about this, and maybe they might help us set the table for the conversation. As I'm bringing those up, just want to thank the MIT students for pulling this together, and also thank all of those people who are keeping everything running. I think we're all more sensitized to that now than we ever have been. Everyone from those folks who we've always thought of as first responders to I think those folks who we now understand as frontline workers in our grocery stores, our trash collectors. So just want to dedicate this to them. Can you confirm you can see my slides?
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks. Very briefly, National Grid US is an electric and gas utility spanning basically from Buffalo to Boston, serving gas and electric to 20 million customers. National Grid UK delivers the electric and gas transmission to the United Kingdom. As we think about some of those same issues that Janet raised, I think helpful background here is to look at some of the legal literature that has been emerging in the past several years. Quite, I would say, a fertile ground right now. A paper that I'm quite fond of from William Boyd in 2014 really looks at what is this concept of public utility, and makes a good argument that we'll need to revitalize and expand the notion of public utility. There was quite a lot of theoretical and legal scholarship on this topic 80 years ago, but it went dormant as we decided that we knew what public utilities were, and it didn't need to be revisited. But I think there is a pretty active set of legal scholarship and regulatory scholarship around this issue. And at least as much as technology, this area of legal scholarship is very important at the moment. As we go through our cadence of formulating investments, we think about three transitions that are happening. And this gets to the title of my slides. Historically, on the left, we've got the demands and the expectations set on utilities. The first, of course, ensuring reliable and affordable energy delivery. That has clearly expanded to include decarbonization, but I would note that this is not yet formally embedded in regulatory criteria. So when we go to a regulatory proceeding, there's not, at least at the state level, formal criteria by which a utility's role in decarbonization is measured. That's in contrast with reliability and affordability. So this, of course, is the triangle, the trilemma, which where the regulators and the business model task is to balance affordability, reliability, and sustainability. Secondly, historically, utilities built, owned, operated, and maintained long-lived shared infrastructure. That was their main role. It was a bit of a banking function to deploy capital, but also to take care of the shared infrastructure over the course of its life. That is also shifting. There is a far more heterogeneous set of infrastructure ecosystems, whether that is in the home, at microgrids, managing two-way power flows. So the network is the second big transition that we're seeing, and the heterogeneity of that network. The third big transition we're seeing is beyond just ensuring universal access, utilities are increasingly facilitating policy-driven market transformation, and this is the S curve. We've done that in the Northeast, policymakers taking the lead and deploying energy efficiency dollars to really bring the largest energy efficiency market into being, but using the utilities as part of, or a large part of, the deployment mechanism. And so we've essentially transformed various markets in the Northeast: LED lighting, home insulation, efficient appliances. So this S curve is another role that utilities play. And I think this leads to the final slide I have, which is there are really three big challenges facing the utility of the future coming into its own. The first is policy assertiveness. Will policymakers deploy the resources, but also the mandates to transform markets? It's not enough to subsidize. In many cases, it does require a limitation of choice, a mandate to take away certain options. And that policy assertiveness has not materialized in a number of areas in the US. You don't see a ban on fossil fuel vehicles the way that you do in the UK, where they've signaled that there will not be internal combustion engines sold after 2035. Second big challenge is institutional coordination. Where will power reside? How will it be shared? We see this in debates, whether it be at FERC or the siting of power lines between Quebec and the Northeast, to how to manage interstate electricity coordination at the ISO level. So the massive questions around institutional power and coordination. And finally, and most acutely now in the era of COVID, prosperity: how much wealth will there be to decarbonize? Will that wealth be broadly distributed? Will we have equitable access to clean and zero carbon electricity and energy? So that's the way that I see the institutional transitions shaping up and the challenges facing us right now. Thanks, Peter.
Great, thanks so much. And Surya, what does the world look like from your perspective in this?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, and I'm also going to share some slides. Basically, I think just to give you a little bit of who we are as Enel, I thought it would be helpful to talk a little bit about myself, but also the company. Janet mentioned technology, and that's kind of my background. So the impact of technology on what we're trying to do with the various topics that we'll talk about today. But Enel itself is a utility, but based in Europe. Our primary locations are in Italy and Spain, and then in South America. And we have the world's largest renewable portfolio for any private company. And I think that's an important capability that we bring and mindset that we bring when we're looking at how we fight climate change. And what we've done is taken the learnings of the transition that we ourselves are going through from being a classic utility to now becoming much more focused on various forms of either renewables or ways to decrease the impact we have on our carbon footprint. And so I thought it would be helpful just to show you that Enel is both a utility and a large one. And at the same time, in North America, we have NLX, which I manage, looking at three things that we can deliver to our customers, primarily the commercial and industrial or government customers. And that's to reduce spend, also earn revenue at the same time, to manage the risk and to improve sustainability. And if you look at the first one, it's how we work with primarily with the C&I customers to enable power purchase agreements. We've seen a lot of that in the renewable area. We ran a very large, one of the largest PPAs for a very large Silicon Valley company. And then topic of today, in terms of how we're looking at both distributed energy resources as well as EVs charging infrastructure. So we've got assets in those. And then curtailment by doing demand response and peak shaving, both again for economic reasons, but as well for the resiliency of the grid. We also work with customers about hedging their long-term energy costs. And we do that by making sure that we work with our own technology and predictive algorithms, and at the same time leverage the availability of multiple generators in different markets. And then of course, we also, we'll talk more about it, I'm sure, is the resiliency solutions that we bring to market. And then last but not least is about sustainability, in the sense that customers care about sustainability. Now it's become not only a buzzword, but it's being driven by stakeholders. And one of the things that Enel ourselves have embraced is our philosophy is that sustainability equals value. And what we mean by that is it is not just doing something good, but it's also doing well. And we've seen that reflected in our market capitalization, being one of the first utilities to go make this transition. And it actually helped our stock price as well, because it was seen as a bet on the future. And now, of course, we're seeing that across, whether it's companies that are themselves pledging to be carbon neutral or even carbon negative, as well as investors looking at these initiatives as a means to recognize the companies that are going to be successful in the future. So I just wanted to give you that quick update on who NLX is. And of course, we'll take some more questions when we start the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Surya. Oh, and I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Peter Kelly-Detwiler, and I'm the principal of NorthBridge Energy Partners. Used to head up Constellation Energy's demand response group, and now I do a lot of writing and consulting in the space, and I'm also working on a book on the transition of power markets, which is more complex than I had imagined it would be. The deeper I dive down the rabbit hole, the more I find there are different warrens in that, and there's just so many interesting directions to go. And you all represent, various phases of that changing industry. Surya, I was interested in your comment about an increased recognition of the market for what you're doing in terms of the value creation about being green. And I would have to think that there's also a risk mitigation strategy in there as well, and that if companies aren't moving in that direction, they face a risk of being spurned by markets on a go-forward basis. Would that be right?
Yes, I see three factors that play in. One is the reality of the market itself, which is costs have come down on renewables. The marginal cost of the more traditional technologies is not that much better than new renewables. So there's the market itself, despite the fact that, of course, there are tax incentives or other types of incentives in place in many cases. The fundamental market reality is driving investment in renewables. Second is the regulatory environment, and that obviously also plays into a financial perspective. And we're seeing that, again, being a European utility, we probably saw that before some of the other markets did. And the third is, if you saw BlackRock, the largest institutional investor, saying that they recognize that the companies of the future are the ones that are going to be making these kind of tough decisions today. And so on the backdrop of wildfires and hurricanes and some of the other issues around needing resiliency, I do see these financial drivers for employees, for shareholders, and for the markets and customers we work with.
Yeah, what struck me about that letter from Larry Fink at BlackRock was he commented that when this happens, this recognition, it will move very, very quickly. I wanted to talk a little bit about this spread of ideas, so viral in a good sense. It's not, to my mind, an accident that some of the leading thinkers in this space are European companies who seem to have had a recognition around carbon issues and leadership, governmental leadership, in ways where if you look at the acquisitions, a lot of the acquisitions have been, for example, Enel being bought, or Sonnen, or many of these companies are being acquired by the Europeans. And yet you're dealing in this multi-jurisdictional space. So Janet, I want to talk to you about your particular job in terms of cross-pollinating these ideas, even from across the pond, what's happening over there. But how do you help to spread really good ideas, business models, create that awareness? What's the mechanism that really helps to move that along the fastest?
I think one of the key mechanisms, Peter, is education. How do you get the information out to people in a way that they can absorb it? And the second key part of that is convenings and collaborations. SEPA runs a number of events. We're in the process now, in the age of COVID, of turning those into online events and online experiences. But the idea is to be collaborative. And if I can step a little into your space, Mackay, when I was at National Grid, part of my job was translating between the UK and the US and the various jurisdictions. How do you understand all the things that go on at the state level? But that imperative was already there in Europe. They understood that climate change was coming. And it's happening here in the US. SEPA has a carbon reduction tracker where we're tracking the number of utilities that are making commitments to be 100% carbon-free, carbon neutral by a certain date. And that is increasing daily. So while there may be some lag in policy right now at the national level, I think businesses are seeing the future. Surya has made this point, and policymakers at the state level are seeing the future. And so what SEPA is trying to do is make sure they have the tools they need to get from where we are today to get to that future.
And are you seeing an increasing level of interest, just sort of a groundswell of, oh, who's doing what over here? I mean, you've been in that job for actually not that long, right?
Yes, and partly I moved to this job from being in a very Northeast focused job, but really to take my mission, if you will, from a regional space to a national space. Because in fact, we do case studies. If you look at some of the documents, we've got a case study on Minnesota. So how can people learn from Minnesota and adopt what they're doing with performance-based regulation, or approach performance-based regulation in their own state using some of the tools there? We looked at Oregon's comprehensive stakeholder process. One of the key takeaways from that was engaging community-based organizations, referred to in the last panel as marginal voices. How do you get them into the mix so that you're making better decisions? So a lot of what we do is we put the data together that you can use as evidence, but we also bring you together with folks so you can share ideas, and we highlight examples from different jurisdictions around the country. I mean, a lot of attention is played to Hawaii on the cutting edge,
Sure.
New York in some ways, but there are many, many more examples around the country that may be more accessible to states that are vertically integrated, more traditionally regulated, as well as for states that are the leading edge states.
Thanks. So I'm a National Grid customer, and here in the southeastern Massachusetts. And I'm thinking my regulatory environment, for example, Mackay, is very different from what they're trying to accomplish in the New York Rev. So we're forming our energy vision model where the concept is the utility would be this DSP, distribution service provider. Can you talk a little bit about how you deal with this sort of former Yugoslavia where, you know, you're basically focusing, you have one company, National Grid, but then you bought up what, NYSEG and, you know, Mass Electric and Narragansett Electric. How do you, it must be very challenging creating a cohesive set of activities and business models within that multi-jurisdictional environment, responding to different regulators. How do you do it?
There's a letter from 2002 you can find it on the internet, the president of the New York ISO writing to the president of the ISO New England saying, we were very close to merging. I'm sorry that we have to cancel the merger discussions. FERC has just put out some guidance on the sort of integrated market model that is going to prevent us from merging. This is a conversation that, you know, fighting the forces of balkanization is a long, long conversation in the Northeast. I do think that we muddle through, but it is a real problem, the policy balkanization. I think that if we recognize that collectively New York and New England are a market the size, almost the size of California, we could move markets. We could, through integration, actually become a super region that actually shifts the energy landscape. As long as it's every state for themselves in the Northeast, we're going to be bit players.
Yeah, it makes it hard for you, Surya, right? I mean, when I was heading up demand response, it drove me nuts that I had to, for example, PJM's peak capacity was 5 days, 5 peak hours. New England's was a single hour. They both had auctions. New York had a 6-month strip. It just drove me nuts. As a vendor, you know, and you're not just selling demand response, you're responsible for managing a whole lot of different groups. How do you deal with that defiance of economy of scale almost?
Yeah, so if you look at what we do, there is the integration of multiple capabilities around distributed energy resources, around demand response, EV, all of these. Look at it as a mixed asset participation in different markets. And so the answer to your question is we have to bring technology and operational capability to solve these different requirements in different markets, whether it's markets like PJM, or in some cases where we have bilateral agreements, because those are not they're not structured the same way as PJM is, or you know, you brought up ISO New England or some of the other regions we participate in. So technology, by using data, call it big data, or certainly data and analytics, to be able to use technology to predict where you need to be, at the same time to use technology to participate in markets, we think is a big part of what vendors like ourselves or companies like ourselves have to do. While of course the operational effectiveness is a big part of it. We cannot be in a situation where there's a situation with, let's say, a summer day that requires curtailment, and if we cannot deliver on it, that would be not only financially bad, but it's bad for the utilities themselves and for the environment. So we try to make sure that we're prepared for those kind of events. And by combining these different assets, we think that we can actually deliver a more predictable participation and performance.
Thank you. So there was a SEPA report that indicated that utility of the future from a distributed energy resource, the DER perspective, they were looking at Pacific Gas and Electric, saying that if every home eventually had 4 distributed devices that were smart, water heater, let's say, battery, vehicle charger, something else, that you could have potentially 20 million distributed devices in a single utility service territory, albeit a large one. When we talk about this utility of the future, are we really talking about utilities of the future in the sense that various areas in the country, because of policy, et cetera, are going to arrive at potentially very different outcomes? Even if we step back and say, let's look just at the gen side. the southwestern part of the United States is where the sun is. The core of the country, the spine, is where the wind is, all things being equal. Might we see radically different models emerging over the next 10 or 15 years because of A, where we have the fuel located, and then B, some of the regulatory philosophies that are pushing in different directions in various parts of the country? Janet, you're looking at this every single day. Do you think that's a logical outcome, that there is no utility of the future? There are utilities models, like a number of them?
I think, so I'm going to step back a little and say, I think that we are driving to a new model for the future. It will not be exactly the same in every part of the country, but the drivers may have started out as policy drivers, but right now they're really technology and fundamental economics drivers. So you're going to see increasing adoption of distributed energy resources, and all utilities are going to have to figure out what's the architecture they need to integrate those and to capture the full value of them. The focus on keeping utility rates low and reasonable is important. You don't want to duplicate resources that may be out there behind the meter. So how are you going to integrate them? So in my mind, you're going to see a different utility model for the future than the one we have seen in the past with central station generation and everything goes in one direction. It's going to be very much two-way communications, two-way power flows. And how we get there may differ state by state, region by region, country by country, but the future will look more similar in the future than perhaps it does right now. When I move from New England to the South, when I retire, so I never have to see snow again, I'm going to recognize how I can use electricity and interact with my utility and interact with the other solution providers who are going to be, like Enel, have a national footprint.
Okay, great, thank you. And Surya, when I mean, you deal with a lot of large customers. I mean, yes, you have your residential and so on, but you've got a lot of the big corporate buyers. Do they ask you what you think the world's going to look like 5 or 10 years from now? Is they're sort of trying to puzzle their way into a future?
If you wouldn't mind, I want to comment on what Janet said.
Please.
I think she's absolutely right, and I think you talked, Janet, about both financial and technology. And to your point about the distributed energy resources, we came up with a new term between front of the meter and behind the meter. We call it behind the grid. And what that means is it's a customer located resource, but sitting in front of the meter. And so if you think about our project we did in New York at the Gateway Mall, where we put in a 4.8 megawatt battery system, it's really participating in the grid in the sense that it's the customer's only there for the space, the real estate. And so it's sitting as if it was a behind the meter installation, except it's in front of the meter. So we call it behind the grid. And if you use that, please give credit to NLX.
I'm going to use it and I will give you credit, because we've been grappling with this front of the meter, behind the meter term, which isn't really what we want to talk about.
Yeah, exactly. And, it's not a utility scale. It's
Right.
Much more single digit megawatts. And so I do think that, so coming back, Peter, to your question, large companies, it's amazing how much things have changed even in the last few years. There was talk of going green, and every company had this nice slogan they put on the wall or in their annual report to say, yeah, we're committed.
Yeah.
But then when you talk to the individuals in the C-suite, they were focused on other things. And now that has completely changed, and you've seen some of the largest companies in the world now talking about the commitment to renewables and decarbonization. So the questions we tend to come up with are, I want to do what my shareholders, my stakeholders are asking, but at the same time, there are two other things that I need. One, I don't want to spend more money, I want to spend less money. And with DR, I could even make money. So there's that first one, which is a financial CFO type of discussion.
Yeah.
The second one is the operational resiliency and risk management and risk mitigation. And with that sustainability being part of it, but it's really about making sure that if I need to run my whatever I do for a business, if I need to run it, I don't want to have any impact to my business while I'm going green. And so that's a discussion we tend to have around how do you have either a distributed energy resource, how do you have hedging against energy costs in the future, and those are the things that we tend to discuss with our customers.
Thank you. And Mackay, I want to ask one final question, and then we'll open it up to audience questions because we've got about 15 minutes left. So you're working on strategy for your utilities in the Northeast. What does this look like to you 10 years out? What kind of a model might we expect to see? And what do you plan for in terms of, how much is on the grid edge, if you will, and what IT preparedness you have to have? Like, everything's moving. What does that future state potentially look like from your planning perspective?
One of the steps we're taking is actually to build a stronger scenario planning capability inside the organization. I think a lot of utilities are probably in this space too, because there are fundamental uncertainties around how much policy support electric vehicles will get, whether the policy support for PV will be durable over the long run. And so we do have a pretty wide range of expectations around how much solar will be on our feeders in 10 years. How much electric vehicle load will there be? How much heat pump load will there be?
Right.
So we're building up a scenario capability right now that helps us understand, but also communicate and involve stakeholders around trying to understand these different pathways. We do expect a lot of PV, but it's going to be quite heterogeneous. You're going to see a lot of it coming on in certain areas and hardly any elsewhere. Similarly, the propensity to adopt EVs is going to differ quite a lot by affluence and by zip code. So you're going to see pretty spotty adoption, barring some much more muscular policy support. It's going to be spotty. So our ability to project that is something that we're really focusing on building up that capability around.
Excellent, thank you. Obviously, this conversation could be a full day or more, and we don't have time for that because there's a lot of great sessions following on. What I'd like to do is open this up to the Q&A. Let me see if I can click down and see the questions. Yeah, okay, so I have a few. Here's one. For the utility of the future, if you had a blank slate, and you do hear this conversation a lot like, well, we already have what we have, right? We have 100 years worth of infrastructure investment. But if we could start from scratch right now, and Janet, you're smiling, so I'm putting you in the hot seat. If you could design, you've been a regulator, you've been involved with the utilities, you've been involved helping vendors sell into the system, and now you're helping set policy for them and so on. So you've been thinking about these sorts of things for a long time. If you could design from scratch in 100 words or less, what would you do?
I could design from scratch. Well,
Yeah.
one, I would step back and say it's not a matter of design. It's going to be driven by the technology. So with the technologies we have today, if we were starting with a blank slate, we might see a much more distributed grid, fewer central station generation. But I would posit we would still see wires connecting me to my neighbor, because you're feeding into my love of the history of the electricity industry and Samuel Insull and all that. But the idea is that we started to build transmission wires because one town realized that it would be cheaper to connect to the neighboring town for resilience and backup than to build multiple generators for itself. So I do think we'd see a more distributed future, but I still think we would see a network. And that will be the case until we have the flux capacitor, where everybody takes their garbage in their kitchen and generates all the electricity they need.
Excellent, thank you. And I think that was less than 100 words, so congratulations.
Okay, a first for me.
Another question here. So basically, from a utilities perspective, and I want to pitch this one to you, Surya, to start with. What new hardware? I mean, you're out in the marketplace, so and Enel is very involved in different hardware technology solutions, obviously customer solution, but what technologies out there besides EV charging infrastructure are you most excited about right now? Is it storage? Is it, what are the things that really move the needle for you from a business and just even an emotional perspective?
I want to start with what Mackay said. I think that's a really important point about scenario planning. And so if you look at the technologies and their evolution, it's driven by what do you expect the future to look like? and working in partnership with the entire ecosystem. We'd like to see, obviously, there's some unsolved problems around long duration storage at reasonable kind of costs. And we also have to be careful that we're looking at the environmental impact of any hardware that we bring into the market. And that's an important consideration that we have. And so the scenario planning, I think, being done along with the investments that venture capital or even large companies are making, there's a significant expectation we have about continued better, more reliable, better performance, cheaper, but also more environmentally friendly hardware. But I would take a step back and also talk about the fact that the importance of the intelligence around how you manage all these assets is probably even more, because the higher the efficiency of any technology through the use of data and analytics and software, the less hardware you have to deploy. And so coming back to the Janet's comment about the resiliency, it's cheaper to go link to your neighbor or neighboring village is how we started. I do think that being able to optimize the utilization of assets, including the wires, so that you don't have to go deploy more and where you can avoid it, or certainly have the better efficient utilization of all of those assets, I think is the real key to how we move forward. I don't think there's going to be, at least as of today, some brand new technology that we're all going to look at and say, wow, but it'll be incremental and better and more efficient utilization.
Thank you.
Peter,
yeah, please.
Can I add one thing that I left out? To the extent we're looking at a carbon-free energy future, and we look at resources like offshore wind or other carbon-free resources that aren't located near load, we may have an overlay of some large transmission to bring those resources to load. So I think until other technologies overtake the value of those large carbon-free technologies, we're going to want to connect to them.
Yeah, for viewers, this is a great book. It's old now, but Peter Schwartz's The Art of the Long View about scenario planning is just a great introduction to that entire topic. And after I read it, my neurons were permanently realigned. So
can I jump in on this, Peter?
What?
Quick comment. I think that the technology or the business model that's most exciting to me, and it also links back to this earlier question about the blank slate. I think a business model that scales up building retrofits to the scale of hundreds of thousands per year is very interesting to me. That is a huge unsolved issue in the Northeast, at least, is how to reduce the fundamental energy load of our building stock. It's not something that a lot of people want to spend their disposable income on. You know, if you've got $5,000 sitting around, which a lot of people don't, you're not going to go put it into fiberglass in the walls. You're gonna get a new kitchen countertop or something. But somehow figuring out how to scale up energy efficiency in a retrofit setting is really important. And this gets to the blank slate question. I think that dream of a blank slate is actually, there's a big boneyard of venture capital firms that, you know, had that dream that energy is a blank slate. That's not what we have. We have a tremendous legacy complex of different networks and building stock. And just speaking to the MIT students, you have to get to know the legacy infrastructure that we have if you're going to come up with good business models, good technologies. It's not a blank slate question.
Yeah, and you really need to understand the power markets and the logic behind them to know what's going to succeed or fail. I often get people asking me or pitching a new technology. I'm like, until you understand how things are built and the economic logic behind markets, you won't know whether you have a cost-effective value proposition or not. You mentioned data, Surya, and information, and it strikes me that this could be the most data-intensive industry in the history of the planet. Because if you are talking about SEPA's scenario with 20 million smart assets in one utility, they have to know what to do, when to do it, and then for how long to do it. And we have locational pricing in a place like Texas. There's 5,000 locational prices every 5 minutes, right? Extrapolate that to millions of devices. that need to know what they're doing, and then you have to track what they did in order to compensate them. That's huge. So Mackay, in that New York Rev, they're talking a lot about the role of the utility involved in that marketplace of assets. Does it mean that ultimately utilities have to be either tightly aligned with IT companies or have to become IT companies? What does that side of the evolution look like?
I think that, and I'm sure the other two panelists have opinions on this, that integration will continue to progress, and it's very important. But there's also, I think, it's healthy to be very skeptical that all that computation has benefit. I think there's an efficient frontier of how much locational marginal pricing you need to get a system to be low carbon and reliable. So I don't think we need to be sending a price to every toaster in the Northeast for this whole system to work. And I think that exploring where that efficient frontier of computational burden is really important. I don't think it's anywhere near as granular as some people do.
Excellent. Well, and indeed, if you only had X% of the assets participating, they would change the cost structure so it wouldn't be that cost effective for the remainder of them to play anyway. You're nodding your head, Surya.
Yeah, I think that the use case is important, where you can, just because you can doesn't mean you must. And I think the real key is to find the use cases where the investment of the data and analytics is going to potentially give you the return on investment. And at the end of the day, we're a business, we're making significant investments in IoT platform, tying it to the data and analytics platform. And for us, that return has to be based on where we can actually get the either increased revenue or decrease in operating expense. And so the use case and understanding that from the customer perspective is the number one thing.
Okay, thank you. I interviewed somebody recently who uses Griddy in Texas. And essentially they buy power wholesale every 5 minutes, which means last year they paid $9 a kilowatt hour for 4.5 hours, although they didn't because they turned certain things off. But they are a very active customer where all their devices were essentially automated. They could pre-cool their house. They struck me as or this person did as a super user, if you will. But someone asks here, when we talk about utility of the future, how do we define the contours of the customer of the future? Yeah, we have those super users like this individual, but you've got a lot of folks. I saw something today. Somebody in Florida has 2 Teslas, 4 Powerwalls, and now those Tesla solar panels on their roof, 28 kW of them. Obviously a very wealthy individual. But what is the customer of the future or customers of the future? What do we think they're going to look like? That's going to be a critical piece of this, right? Anyone have any thoughts on that?
We've surveyed our customers, thousands of them over the past several years, and the prevalence of energy turbo nerds is extremely low. So I think you're going to find a lot of people who want it to be on and affordable and clean, and that's it. They're going to spend their discretionary time worrying about their kids and their family and their hobbies. So I think you certainly have to have products and services available for the turbo nerds, but at the end of the day, I don't see that sort of engagement with energy being the dominant form of how society is organized.
I would agree with Mackay. I think when we assume that in the future we need every customer to be very active in order to make this work, we're going to fail. And it is not failure if customers don't choose a competitive electricity supplier in restructured states. Because in fact, if some people do, I mean, there are many other ways in which that has supported wholesale competition and reduced prices. As Mackay said, for most of us, myself included, I don't use enough electricity to spend a lot of time thinking about it in my personal life. I think about it all day at work, but I don't take a lot of actions personally. I want it to be easy and something I don't have to think about. And I think to the extent there are companies like Enel or that are coming in and offering me the service of managing my house, my retrofitted house, perfect. Then I don't have to do anything. So I think you have to think about marketing, the utilities providing the service, competitive providers providing the service that customers really want, which is on, affordable, I like that phrase, and clean.
Great. Well, we've got just like 1 or 2 minutes left. So can I get a closing 30-second statement from each one of you about the utility of the future? Put you on the spot. Who wants to start? Surya?
Sure. I think I resonate with the statement that both Mackay and Janet made about the end customer. I entered the energy business less than a year ago. And until then, I didn't think of a lot of these things, which obviously now I'm deep in the middle of. So I do think that any utility of the future has to start with what is the customer experience. All of us have gotten very used to now having easy to use, easy to deploy, and that's both for residential, but also in the commercial, industrial, government space. I think it's all about the customer experience.
Thank you. Mackay?
I think that we've got really a huge problem with the lack of federal leadership, and that the utility of the future is one topic, but if we're serious about finding an affordable decarbonization future for the US, it's going to be really hard to do it at a state by state and city by city level. And so we've got to take that political problem seriously. It's going to be a really important backdrop to all of the other sort of technology and regulatory decisions we make. So there are real political issues that we need to grapple with. And I think that also we have to keep equity in mind. We have a lot of customers who are struggling to make ends meet, and whatever solutions we find for the utility of the future, it has to work for those customers as well.
Thank you. And Janet, I'll give you the last word.
Okay, I would say the electricity industry is one that is imbued with the public interest, to borrow a phrase from regulatory, I'm going to say philosophy. And I think you have to recognize the close linkage between the utility of the future and the regulatory and policy framework of the future. And regulation and policy can either hinder getting to that clean energy future, or it can enable getting to that clean energy future. So picking up on what Mackay said, those are big challenges that we need to address, and we need to recognize that linkage.
Well, thank you all. It's been a most illuminating conversation, and I appreciate you all taking the time, and stay healthy. Thanks.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you.
Thank you.